The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. At that time, Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to John to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" But Jesus answered him, "Let it be so now, for thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness." Then he consented. And when Jesus was baptized, immediately he went up from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and coming to rest on him. And behold, a voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. It occurred to me during the week that the baptism of Jesus and my baptism have two things in common. One is that water was used. He was up to his waist in the River Jordan, and I would have been sprinkled with water over a font in the Brooms Church at Ledgate. That was on the 22nd of May, 1948. I remember it well. It snowed. In fact, if that had happened in the middle of the 19th century in France, they'd have built a cathedral in honor of the fact that it snowed on the day that this guy was baptized. The other thing we have in common is that neither of our mothers was present. I was baptized about 4 days after I was born, which would be the custom in those days. Many of us will remember that well, that children were baptized, infants were baptized as soon as possible after they were born in case they died. And if they died before they were baptized, the belief was they wouldn't go to heaven, which was absolute nonsense, of course, but that's what we believed. And thankfully, Pope Benedict put an end to all that and said, babies who die who aren't baptized don't in any way banned from heaven. That's just not how God works, really. But Mary wouldn't be there, the mother of Jesus, because Jesus had left Nazareth in a shocking kind of way. Nazareth was a very small town. There would be no more than 200 people. And it was a very isolated town. Now there's 70-odd thousand people live there. It's bigger than Washington and Penshaw together, I think. But then there was only a couple of hundred. And it was very, very Jewish. We know that from archaeological digs, that everything is Jewish. There's nothing Gentile really been dug up near the place for a long time. And it was a place that was isolated. There wasn't on a trade route. People wouldn't be passing through it to go anywhere else. So Jesus and Joseph would probably be the sort of handymen in the village. They worked with their hands. They weren't strictly speaking carpenters. They were people who worked with their hands. So they would work with metal for farmers, for plows, and they would work with wood, and they'd work with stone, building walls and so on. So it'd be very little influence from anywhere else. But somehow Jesus heard of John and what he was doing. And in his late 20s, he decided that he'd go and experience something of what John was doing down in the Jordan, about 80, 90 miles away. He would have been to Jerusalem on a number of occasions during his life. Well, we know he was there when he was like 12 or 13. But it was a demand that adult Jewish males would visit the temple 3 times a year if they could afford it. And so he may well have experienced big crowds because Jerusalem would be packed for the big feasts of Passover and so on. But he wouldn't have met a crowd like that around John. But John himself did something very radical. He left behind his whole expected role as a priest. His father had been high priest, so he would have a position of responsibility and respectability and he would be looked up to. And John turned his back on all of that and went into the place of bewilderment, into the wilderness, into the desert. And he began to preach. And the people who came to John were people who would never be allowed in the temple. People who were sinners, people who were into prostitution, people who had skin disease, Roman soldiers, a whole motley crew of folk who would never be allowed in the temple. People who were poor. At that time, in order to celebrate certain festivals, you had to use certain special dishes, which were only used for cooking particular foods. If you couldn't afford those dishes, then you couldn't celebrate properly. Therefore, you were outside the Jewish tradition, outside the law. So Jesus finds himself in the middle of this motley crew. And the picture we have of him is standing there in the River Jordan, surrounded by people who are way beyond the edge of society, being talked to by John, who's inviting them to change their way of life. And John is clearly, as we heard in the gospel, Frank just read there, that John was a bit confused by this. Like, I shouldn't be doing this to you. You know, you don't need to be reconciled, sort of thing. And Jesus uses this, well, he didn't use this word, but the English translation is righteousness, really weird word. It really means that Jesus said to John, I'm doing this because this is what God wants. God wanted Jesus to be totally immersed in the human condition. So he's standing in the river, surrounded by folks who would, as I say, never get near proper liturgical worship in the temple. That's the folk he was identifying with. It's interesting just to think that in the house or the hut or the cave in which Jesus was brought up, there would be not a single book, mainly because books hadn't been invented. But actually, there wasn't a single scroll either. Scrolls were incredibly expensive. The scroll of Isaiah, which was discovered in 1947 in a cave near the Dead Sea, is 24 foot long. That's like 8 yards long. And handwritten, obviously. Didn't have photocopies much in those days. So it was really expensive stuff. So people didn't have books or scrolls in their houses. But he would know the scriptures. And it's interesting that Matthew, the gospel writer, has chosen to quote from that prophet Isaiah about this being a beloved son and being sent to bring good news to the poor. And while we don't actually hear or read the description of the baptism of Jesus, nowhere does it say John came into the river and poured water over him. It doesn't say any of that. What we do have is the incidents surrounding the baptism. So when Jesus comes out of the water, the heavens part. Now, when we use the phrase about the heavens opening, we mean that it's going to teem a rain. That's what we mean. That wouldn't make sense to the people then. They meant that there was no gap between earth and heaven, that God was in the earth. And that gap has closed now permanently. And then it says that a dove appeared and hovered over the water. And all the Jews present, maybe not the Roman soldiers, but the Jews present would know that referred to the first verse of the Bible, of Genesis. The Spirit hovered over the earth, over the water in Genesis, and hovered over the water of the Jordan. So the Spirit of God is again present here on the earth. And then the voice from heaven says, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." The voice of God says to Jesus, "You are my beloved Son." In other words, I completely agree with the choice you have made. I completely agree with you moving beyond your Jewish tradition, which really demanded that you stayed at home and looked after your increasing elderly parents. I totally condone the fact that you are here amongst this rabble of people, that you are there immersed fully in the human condition. It must have been an incredible thing to appreciate, for the Lord to appreciate that God was saying, you are beloved and you are absolutely right. Because he had completely broken with Jewish tradition by leaving Nazareth, leaving home, joining John. We don't know how long he stayed with John. I suspect, personally, he must have stayed some time. Jesus wouldn't be used to working with folk who were completely beyond the pale. Not at all. He wouldn't have been used to talking to crowds of people. And maybe he learned some of these things from John. John was totally inclusive in the way he welcomed whoever came to listen to him. Now, Jesus didn't follow exactly the same ministry as John. He changed a bit. He was more than happy to celebrate, share meals with anybody, rich, poor. He was more than happy to say to tax collectors sitting up trees, come down because I'm eating in your house tonight. But Jesus followed this example of being totally inclusive. So the experience of baptism was a radical change in the life of the Lord. And after it, he goes into the desert for 40 days and he's on retreat, if you like. And after that retreat, he goes up to the north and he begins preaching. He begins his public ministry. It's a fabulous feast. It marks a huge difference in the life of Jesus. And it left me wondering, what does it mean for us today to celebrate this feast? Well, I've got a picture of Jesus sitting up in heaven, with his head in his hands, sort of thinking, things haven't half changed since I was baptized. They don't do it like that anymore. I mean, they do, actually. People are still baptized in the Jordan. I've witnessed it there. And you do get plunged into the thing, and mainly evangelical Americans, the time I was there, but it was very dramatic. But it's not the case here, is it? It wasn't the case in Ledgate in May 1948 either. Something's moved. Something's changed. Quite a bit has changed. But the meaning hasn't. The meaning of baptism hasn't changed. The way we celebrate it has. I think Jesus is probably chuffed a bit that mentality that was around in the 40s and 50s and 60s, 70s, that a baby had to be baptized as soon as possible after it was born, or else it wasn't safe. I'd be pleased that all that's moved on. Actually, if I'm honest, I must have baptized probably hundreds of children here in Washington over those 7 and a bit years. But I secretly always thought that actually they've been baptized at home by their grandmothers under the tap. I wouldn't be at all. You're sitting smiling there. I bet you've done it. I bet you've either baptized your own bairns or your grandchildren. I bet you have. So in a sense, I was just kind of putting the final tick to the box, really, because you're already there ahead of me. But that was a crazy notion. It was around from the 16th century that you had to be baptized. Otherwise, you weren't going to be in heaven. That's gone, thank God. And the Lord will be delighted about that. But he's maybe thinking, I'm not sure they've got the rest of it, though. Do we really feel? Do we, adults here now, really feel that we're called to do something radical about including people? Do we as communities really feel that if we actually put our voices and our hearts together, we could say powerful things about homelessness, about refugees, about asylum seekers, about the planet Earth, which we're busily abusing at an amazing rate? I wonder if the Lord is thinking, I wonder if maybe this year, on the celebration of my baptism, they'll grasp something of this and really get a hold of it and go for it. It's a tough one. It's a tough one because we've rather domesticated our sacraments and made them safe, whereas baptism introduced Jesus into a life that wasn't safe. He left his safe life in Nazareth, but he entered into a world that was extremely unsafe, as we know well from his death and his subsequent resurrection. Of course, Jesus had form being associated with folks who were on the margins of things, because when you had your crib up, you'd have shepherds around the place. And they were the first people to come and be welcomed in the presence of the Lord. And the great thing about shepherds was that they were utterly disreputable. They were only hired for one day at a time. You didn't hire them for 2 days because there was no guarantee they'd turn up for the second one. They were utterly disreputable. But they were the folk who were welcomed first. So this feast is great because it does challenge us to think about how we are, and actually, maybe a little bit more baptized today than we were on the feast day last year, because we've had another year of maybe taking the opportunity to think and reflect and to pray and to wonder. Let me just end with a little tale that is kind of associated with baptism. You know that during baptism, and in fact later on, just in a few minutes' time, we have a little ceremony of lighting candles when the names of those who've been baptized are read out. And during baptism, a candle is given either to the father of it, if it's a child, or to the adult who's baptized. And it's lit from the Paschal candle. It's the risen Jesus. We're part of the community of the risen Lord. Well, I'm still celebrating Mass in Durham prison. And when we celebrate Mass on a Friday morning, we use the readings for the following Sunday. So it was my turn to celebrate it for the first Sunday of Advent. So there we are. It was about 25 or 30 lads there. And at the beginning, just before Mass, I said, can I have a volunteer to light the first candle on our wreath here in front of the altar? One lad put his hand up really keen. And the other lads kind of cheered. So I said, yeah, fine. Yeah, you come light the candle. So I give him the taper and lit the candle, and the cheering went on, and I thought, I know, and you might be thinking the same, I know what's up here. This fellow was in for arson. But at the very least, he was using his gifts for the benefit of the community, all right? I mean, that's a bit of a stretch, I have to say. It is stretching the story a bit. But he was using what he was good at for the benefit of the community. That's what being baptized is about. Being a community of people who belong to the community of the risen Lord, who use the gifts that God's given us for the benefit of our own community and for the planet and the world we live in. It is a most radical feast. And that little lad in prison in Durham, I think he's going to be, I might see him again fairly soon. I think he could be there for a while. He at least illustrated for me that with a smile on his face and laughter in the hearts of all his mates, that was kind of what it's about. And if we get a hold of that, then I think we've got the notion of what the baptism of the Lord is about.